Przed nami wręczenie medalu.
Shall now have the ceremony of the
Czy jesteśmy gotowi?
Courage and Integrity Medal, which will be received, and the president of the chapter of the medal, Courage and Integrity, Mr. Professor Krasnodebski, is here with us. We shall then hear the laudation for this year's winner. I believe the emotions are at their peak. It will be a surprise. Every year we decide to give the medal titled Courage and Integrity. We reward integrity and courage to promote the values and also courage to defend Poland's good name abroad in a credible way. This year, the chapter, and I shall not mention all the members' names, this chapter was established by Madam Jadwiga Kaczyńska, and it is composed of recipients of our prizes. Tomorrow we shall have the ceremony of the granting of the Lech Kaczyński Prize. And for 2024, the medal Courage and Integrity goes to Professor David Engels, a historian, a philosopher,
twórcy prawemu i sprawiedliwemu, rzeczywiście osobie,
as the just and fair creator and the person who published many magnificent papers and interviews and the international media dealing with Poland. Professor Engels was one of a few credible sources of information on Poland, so I'm absolutely delighted to award this medal to him. Let me also add that the decision by the chapter was made with the same unequivocally. These are the members of the chapter members.
Joanna Wnuk Nazarowa, Bronisław Wittstein, Ryszard, Legutko, Jonasz Kapusta, no I muszę jeszcze wymienić sekretarza.
And the secretary and the driver behind this, Maryna Miklaszewska. Now let me ask Professor Legutko to award the medal to the prize winner.
O poproszenie laudacji wygłosimy pana Oliviera.
Szanowni Państwo,
Ladies and gentlemen, recently there have been and still are few voices speaking about Poland and the foreign media from a conservative point of view. The voices of people trying to present reality as it really is, without manipulating, lies, slander, and without regard to the consequences of presenting such opinions. The voice of Professor David Engels, a Belgian-born historian, was one of those. And the German language media, it was probably the only voice of the native German-speaking commentator who broke out of the chorus of political political correctness, the dominant left liberal discourse in the French-speaking media, Belgian and French, he was one of very few. Professor David Engels has a perfect command of not only Goethe's language, but also Voltaire's. He was born and grew up in the heart of a small German-speaking community in Belgium, not far away from the former capital of Charlemagne's empire. It was in Aachen, located in Germany, that he completed his studies in history and philosophy, and specialized in particular in the history of ancient Rome. But not only that, Professor Engels is an expert on all human civilizations. This is why he became interested in the ancient part of her history, because he simply did not want to limit the geographical area of his research. As he himself says, for about 30 years he's been trying to understand the great civilizations from within, approaching them without prejudice, and he admires them all, including our own, the Western European civilization, whose first capital was located at the beginning of the 9th century in Aachen. A civilization born of the fusion of the Roman and Germanic worlds, and soon the West Slavic world, whose common bond over the centuries was the Roman Catholic faith, and whose the ancient language of the Romans survived as lingua franca. The civilization which espouses nation-states. Professor David Engels likes to emphasize the emergence of European civilization with its roots in the ancient Greco-Roman world, but also the Middle East, thanks to Christianity, preceded the emergence of nation-states. Our today's award winner, moreover, described his own identity as European. This is also due to the specific location of the German-speaking community in Belgium and the special nature of the country. Unlike the Walloon and Flemish communities, the German-speaking Belgians who joined this small kingdom after the Second World War do not have a separate European identity rooted in history. One might say that everything predestined David Engels to become a typical Brussels cosmopolitan. Had it not been for his fascination with the history of human civilizations, including his own, a contradiction of modern Mokeism, this would probably have been the case, especially since he admits his parents and himself were only culturally Catholic, or, as they sometimes say, non-practicing Catholics. The ways of the Lord, however, are unsearchable. The Lord God used the literature of Tolkien, of whom Professor Engels is a great fan, and used the beauty of the Tridentine liturgy, which captured our laureate from the first moment. And he also used his love for the man to convert him to the Christian Catholic faith. Ubi caritas et amor ibi Deus. Where is love, there is God. Every civilization has a transcendental dimension, notes Professor David Engels. Civilization allows people to develop their impulse toward transcendence, and transcendence manifests itself in all the wonderful diversity that had always moved David Engels. It moved and encouraged him to discover again and again what human beings since the dawn of the time have been able to perceive in God, in nature, and in all other human beings. Whoever loves God, he also loves the truth. And here I must disappoint you. Professor David Engels did not defend Poland's good name in the Western European media out of love for Poland. He values and respects Poland. He spent 6 years of his life with his family here. He conducted his research at the Western Institute of Poznan, where several valuable collective works were written under his editorship, such as Laudatio Europae or Europa Eterna, Roots Are Future. We'll return to the idea of Hesperialism developed by Professor Engels, that is, to his proposal for saving Europe, because it is impossible to speak of our laureate without mentioning the concept of the future of our civilization which stems from knowledge and understanding of the past. Professor David Engels defended the good name of Poland, as I already said, not out of sympathy for Poland, but out of love for the truth and love for our civilization. In the eyes of Professor Engels, slandering and attacking Poland simply because the Polish people elected such a parliamentary majority and such a government and no other is destructive to the very idea of European integration. For our historian is a supporter of European integration, but not the kind of integration that is being forced upon us, often in violation of democratic principles and the rule of law and in breach of the EU treaties by the current Brussels elites. He is not in favor of that kind of integration that is still being forced upon us by elites in Brussels, Berlin and Paris, with a draft 267 amendments to the European treaties adopted after the end of the last year's term by the European Parliament. Professor Engels is instead in favor of integration modeled on the former Holy Roman Empire. As you can read in the Polish Wikipedia, the Holy Roman Empire is colloquially the first German Reich, but as Professor David Engels points out, in the first centuries of its existence was a multinational state, strong on the outside, but leaving a lot of freedom and respecting national identities inside the empire, and this is precisely the opposite of today's European Union. Admittedly, if it were German proposing to us, to me French or to you Poles, a return to the idea of the Holy Empire, which in my language is called Saint-Père Romain Germanique, the reactions might be, to put mildly, hostile. But if such a proposal is made by a nationless Belgian, or rather Belgian of European nationality, I myself have heard him claim, half joking and half seriously, that he is a European nationalist, and as a German-speaking Belgian, he has no other nationality than European nationality. And yet, Professor David Engels, even before he started to speak truthfully about Poland, contradicting the dominant narrative in the Western world, Western European media, was not too fond of the enlightened European left liberal academic elite of Free University of Brussels, where he became a professor in the Department of Roman History. Prior to that, from 2005 onwards, he was assistant professor in the Department of Ancient History at the University of Aachen. Until 2017, he was also editor-in-chief of the scholarly journal Latomus, published by the Society of Latin Studies in Brussels, and is now president of the Oswald Spengler Society for the Study of Humanity and World History, which he also co-founded in 2017. As a reminder, German professor of culture and history Oswald Spengler is the author of the famous work Twilight of the West, published in 1917. During the First World War, the Great War in Germany, and translated into several other languages after the war. As I found out accidentally, because Professor David Engels, a modest man, does not like to boast, he was knighted a few months ago as a Knight of the Order of St. George by Charles von Habsburg-Lothringen. This House of Habsburg-Lothringen was the ruling dynasty from which the Roman German emperors from 1745 through 1806, and the Austrian emperors from 1804 and 1918 descended. Professor Engels' main interests amongst the great civilizations of the past include ancient Rome, the history of Roman religion, the Seleucid state, and comparative historical research. And it was that comparisons that probably cost him the most trouble in the Brussels academic world, before speaking the truth about what was going on in Poland, finally closed the way for him to return to his alma mater and to most other European universities. This year, after leaving the Western Institute in Poznan, he started working at the Brussels branch of MCC, the Hungarian Matthias Corvinus College. and he also teaches at the Vendée Catholic Institute. By contrast, he's unlikely to return to a free, inverted commas, University of Brussels. Before he left for Poland, the research and statements by Professor Engels comparing the times of the collapse of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC to the crisis experienced by the European Union today was not very much like that. As David Engels proves, he demonstrates emphatically in his work. In the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic faced similar problems to those of modern Europe: mass immigration and consequent identity crisis, loosening of customs, the disappearance of religious practice, the pursuit of careers, the demographic winter crisis of the institution of family, abortion and euthanasia. It also shows how many Romans were relieved and the Republic plunged into increased chaos, where there were even civil wars, by the advent of the dictatorship of Emperor Augustus, accompanied by the return to tradition, conservative values, to what lay in the foundation of the Roman Empire's power. The dynamic development of the Roman civilization was the thesis, then was the antithesis, denial of what Rome constituted, and plunged to deeper crises. Now came the synthesis, the conscious return to tradition, which, however, entailed ossification of Roman civilization, must ultimately have led to its collapse, which occurred in the case of the Western Roman Empire, Latin Empire, 5 centuries later. All great civilizations go through a similar cycle, shows this eminent historian in his research. The same applies to our European civilization. The immanence prevails. That is, material, temporal dimension begins to dominate. And then there is a decline of a civilization. It started in the 16th century, says a professor. And today, wokeism is the extreme, absurd denial of what creates our European Western civilization. Unfortunately, this is also part of our civilization. However, observing the history of past civilizations allows us to assume that the phase of synthesis of European civilization is coming. The moment of conscious return to tradition, to the foundations of our civilization, including Christianity, is approaching. Must this be accompanied by the end of democracy and the end of European republics, as it was the case under the first Roman emperor? Well, not necessarily. If we build a subsidiary Europe, a Europe based on national identities and on the traditions and history of its individual peoples, a Europe modeled on the ancient medieval Holy Roman Empire, we can still save not only our civilization but also our democracy and freedoms that distinguish and constitute our strength worldwide. This is precisely what David Engels, Professor Engels, refers to by the term Hesperialism. Hesperialism is the word he himself invented a few years ago precisely to define what he calls conservative European patriotism, as opposed to the EU Europeanism. This should appeal to the majority of the Poles. Poles are a nation attached, for the most part, to its sovereignty, but they're also a very pro-European nation, as surveys conducted since the accession of the most Syrian Republic to the European Union show us. So, the whole of Poland should therefore become Hesperialist. The word invented by our laureate today comes from ancient Greek. It comes from the name of the islands of Hesperides, lying in the furthest west of the Greek world. Hesperides became an ancient Greek synonym of the edge of the West world. And this, argues David Engels, reflects the longing of a European for what lies on the other side of the ocean. For centuries, Europeans were driven by a desire to overcome barriers, to cross the horizon, and to discover what lies beyond. I myself grew up in the French town of Vienne. In the first centuries after Christ, it had a population of around 30,000. It was a very important center. Today we have also a population of around 30,000. It is impossible to build anything in Wien and not come across during the earthworks of the remains of the Romans. Once my father dug up a tree in his garden, uncovered a former Roman road, and people knew that the road must have been there due to the terrain location. Another neighbor had to actually build up all the remains of an old aqueduct. And I saw myself those stones of the Roman road. They were building very sturdily, and there were many ruins where you can see they had sidewalks or pavements and toilets and a system of running water through plumbing and piping. And amongst many remnants there is a small Roman church from the 8th century where you can admire Roman columns. Columns reutilized in the 8th century from early Roman buildings. For the past 30 years I have lived in Poland and I return to Wien every year. I've seen the city change due to mass immigration becoming less and less European, more and more distant or exotic to me. Whatever I may say, in the town where I grew up, you can see all too clearly the rise and fall of a great civilization, yesterday and today. This is why Professor David Engels' statements speak to me in a very vivid way. I myself have also written about Poland from a right-wing perspective, as a conservative and as a Catholic. I have been asked several times whether I'm exposing myself with this. No, I'm not an academic and I have never been threatened with any consequences. There was no risk to me. Yet Professor David Engels has exposed himself and is facing specific consequences. The consequences of his courage and credibility, integrity, the consequences of his using his extensive historical knowledge to warn us Europeans and to offer us a natural way out of the current crisis, to ensure our civilization's continued existence, and thus to ensure the continued existence of Poland and its flourishing without our common European civilization. This is why I have no doubt that he deserves a medal, and in particular the medal Courage and Credibility.
Dziękujemy za laudację.
Well, thank you very much for the laudation.
I prosimy laureata,
And now we shall hear from our laureate, Professor David Engels, the laureate of this year's medal, Courage and Integrity.
Dziękuję Państwu za
Thank you all very much for this standing ovation.
Yes, Your Excellencies, dear ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my warmest thanks to Professor Krasnodebski, Professor Legutko, the selection committee of the organization Polska, wielki Projekt, for the great honor you have bestowed upon me today, and to Olivier Bault for his kind and very touching Laudatio. I feel extremely honored by this sign of recognition of my work. And when I think about the fact that only some years ago the late Sir Roger Scruton was distinguished with the same medal, it is not false modesty when I would like to emphasize that I do not really deserve this prize, or at least only with certain reservations. Therefore, I would like to mention first all those without whom I could hardly have accomplished my task. My colleagues here in Poland for their kind support, especially Dr. Justyna Schulz from the Institut Zachotny, my Polish media partners such as TVP, Radio Polskie, Gazeta Polska, TVP World, Ordo Juris or Deliberatio for the lively exchange I had with them, my friends in Warsaw for many endless conversations about the situation of the country, and of course the media in which many of my texts were published, above all Kato, Tichys Einblick, Junge Freiheit and the Tagespost, but also Radio Courtoisie, TV Liberté, the Journal du Dimanche, Dissidentia, the Tribuna del País Vasco, El Correo de España, the European Conservative and the Spectator. And should I have forgotten anyone, I apologize very sincerely. Of course, I've tried hard in recent years not only to honor and defend our European civilization, but also to report on Poland in the non-Polish, especially German, but also French, Spanish and English media, in a way that I myself believed to be truthful to the best of my knowledge, and which, it seems to me, contradicted in many ways the image conveyed by the mainstream media. But actually, I'm anything but an expert on these issues and ended up rather by coincidence in a role that is not really mine and should never have been mine if it had not turned out that I was one of the few who wanted to play it at all. To this day, I've paid a high price for my decision to get involved in a fight for which I was extremely ill-equipped, but looking back, I regret none of what I said or wrote. After all, the fight I waged in and for Poland was ultimately also a fight for what has always been closest to my heart, the European civilization. And this brings us to the real content of this short speech. Even if it has been somewhat overlooked in the recent years, I'm actually not a journalist, but a university professor, not a writer of daily articles, but a philosopher of history, not a politician, but a scholar, not an active, but a contemplative person. From childhood on, I've been most fascinated by the incredible diversity and beauty with which people have tried to express the idea of transcendence and to understand God, humanity, and nature in their own very specific and inimitable way through the various great civilizations. If I were to show you around my library today, you would see that it is considerably better stocked with literature on ancient China, classical antiquity, Egypt, Islam, and even the Maya than on Europe. And I probably spent considerably more time trying to understand Buddhist thought, Chinese garden design, Egyptian architecture, or Greek political thought than reading books on contemporary history. While the latter may indeed sometimes sharpen my political analysis, only the former provides me with the fundamental broadening of my horizons that I have been striving for decades. What does all this have to do with the portrayal of Poland in the media, you may ask impatiently, and you are absolutely right to do so. Well, I'm convinced that all great civilizations are equally valid and valuable paths to the one supreme goal, which is the knowledge of transcendence. And I learn an incredible amount from studying these civilizations every day, not only about so-called exotic perspectives on the main questions of our lives, but also about the blind spots of our own civilization. But at the same time, I love my own European civilization more than any other and would like to maintain and defend it in a privileged way. Why this is by no means a paradox, I explained in detail in a speech I gave a few months ago at the National Conservatism Conference in Brussels. So here, I will just say first that even universal human love does not diminish the special responsibility that one owes to one's immediate neighbor and to the Ordo Caritatis. Second, that ultimately only one's own civilization is the one that we can fully understand and can develop further. And third, that I'm convinced that by bringing us into the world as Europeans, God has also given us the task of nurturing this specific civilization. My particular love for Europe, and as you can imagine, I'm talking here about a true Europe, not about what the European Union has done to this ideal, also has another reason. As you know, I'm Belgian, so for this reason alone I have a very weak national identity, but it gets even worse. I belong to the minority of the German-speaking Belgians, which numbers just around 70,000 people, and unlike other minorities, has never had a strong regional identity of its own, such as Alsace, Corsica, or Brittany, but is purely a product of historical chance. This means that it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, for me to establish a genuine regional or national identity. In fact, these would have been the ideal conditions for me to become an uprooted, globalized, left-wing liberal cosmopolitan. But I turned out differently. Living at the intersection between German, French, and to a certain extent, Burgundian, Lotharingian identity, I have discovered European civilization as a genuine, so to speak, national fatherland for me. That is, as the identity that unites and transcends my own often contradictory identities more or less harmoniously and meaningfully. In a sense, I have become a European nationalist, if we may naively use the word nationalist here in its original sense. Europe in its entirety is for me what would be the nation state for others. And this true patriotic commitment to the idea of Europe is something that I have called Hesperialism in order to distinguish it from the fake Europeanism preached in Brussels today. This European nation is, of course, threatened everywhere, and thus we are gradually also approaching an explanation of what brought me to Poland. On the one hand, I freely admit that one of the reasons was a certain sense of adventure. After 10 years of working as the chair for Roman history at the University of Brussels, I desired to experience something completely different. On the other hand, my decision to migrate to Poland was also due to the fact that my activities had increasingly shifted from pure ancient history to rather political analysis, and that the Institute Zahotny was a very interesting employer as it wanted me to deal with European politics from a civilizational and identitary standpoint. But in the background, there was also the realization that Belgium, my home country, had completely embarked on a path of cultural self-destruction, while in Poland, an exciting experiment in pro-European, Christian, social, and conservative government was taking place, in which it seemed extremely honorable and meaningful for me to participate in. Need I add that it was also an extremely attractive prospect for my family to spend a few years in a country that in many respects offered more normal living conditions than my own homeland. A strong middle class, a society still largely shaped by Christianity, an extremely homogeneous population, a certain optimism about the future, excellent economic prospects, very low crime rates, a certain serenity in interactions with one another. All of this may seem like an everyday banality from a Polish perspective, but in Western Europe, it has already become the absolute exception. When coming here, I had originally declared that I did not want to deal with immediate Polish day-to-day politics in my work, but only with European questions. But as fate would have it, I was increasingly contacted by German and French media outlets as a local point of contact to comment on individual developments here. At first, I was a bit reluctant. For one thing, I'm anything but a specialist in the contemporary history of Central Europe. For another, I was never able to learn Polish to the extent that would have been necessary, as the workload since my arrival was simply too great. But I gradually allowed myself to be persuaded to answer the questions put to me to the best of my knowledge, because I quickly realized something that I would never have thought possible before. I was, and still am actually, one of the very few non-Polish-born essayists who has ever tried to develop a constructive understanding of the former Polish government and to express it publicly. At first glance, this may seem surprising, as there is no shortage of much more competent Polonists, journalists, and political scientists in Western Europe. However, it quickly became clear to me that they either did not comment at all or only rarely on critical topics, or were permanently employed by those media outlets that were ideologically clearly sympathetic to the then left-wing liberal opposition, which is now in government. In other words, if I did not comment on certain topics, no one else would, and the Western European readership would have to get their knowledge about Poland from sources that were clearly anti-conservative. That was the deciding factor for me. Accordingly, and besides my academic work as a historian of past civilizations, I've tried over the last 6 years to critically follow political events, at least as far as I understood them, and as far as they could interest the Western European public, although my main interest lay always in the questions that touched on my core concerns, namely the manifold internal and external threats to our European civilization, which could be seen in an exemplary way here in Poland, where the resistance had not yet been completely silenced. If I look back on these last 6 years, I'm myself sometimes astonished by the amount of my own production. I published 6 monographs, 13 books, not counting the translations, 100 scholarly papers, and around 800 papers or interviews for the large media. And in retrospect, it was inevitable with all that I would make many enemies, especially in the German media. Until I moved to Poland, I may have been occasionally regarded as a conservative thinker in the German media. However, my refusal to participate in the widespread demonization of the outgoing Polish government and my attempt to endorse its general program of a Christian, social and cultural renewal for Poland and all of Europe, however much one may legitimately dispute the quality of its implementation, has not been forgiven. I was thus called an advocate of dictatorship. And since this, like other warning shots, was not enough to silence me, the attributes have become more and more extreme, so that now, in Germany, I am, believe it or not, counted among the thinkers of the extreme right, and have suffered corresponding reprisals. Although my fundamental positions have never really changed since I started writing, and although the ideals I defend correspond, I believe, to what well-educated Europeans have been able to agree on for several centuries, even millennia, without much discussion. I have never wanted to polarize, and I've always tried to avoid extreme opinions, venerating God, loving the European civilization, caring for the nation state, being proud of the efforts of our forefathers, protecting the family, respecting the complementarity between men and women, being helpful to our neighbor, defending our freedom, being tolerant of other opinions, in short, being chivalric and striving for what is good, true, and beautiful. All this has always seemed eminently supra-political to me, but I fear that nowadays, even these innocent ideals have become more and more contested and defamed, especially by the ideology of wokeness. Hence, it was not always easy to bear the malicious and unjustified criticisms of certain journalists and alleged experts without complaint. But at last I experienced firsthand how partisan, unfair, and even mendacious many of those media outlets have become that were considered the epitome of objective neutrality just 20 years ago, a sad but important lesson. During these years, Poland has become very dear to me, not only as a bastion of European identity, but also as a country in itself, which from now on, no matter what may happen, will represent an important part of my life. The kindness of the Polish nation, its magnificent cultural past, its almost immeasurable political resilience against foreign rulers, and much more have significantly expanded and corrected my previous view of Europe, which was essentially limited to the Franco-German dimension. And Poland has not only become part of my history, but also of that of my 3 sons. The 2 oldest have not only become bilingual, but also trilingual in these years, and therefore speak perfect Polish, and in many ways know and understand this country considerably better than the one they actually come from. And our third son has even been born here in Poland and considers this country as his true home country, as his Poland, as he says. Despite everything, however, it must also be understood that the fight of the last 6 years has essentially been lost, at least for the time being. And by that I mean not only the specific question of parliamentary majorities and governing parties, but also the general situation of the country. Because even to me as an outsider, it has not remained hidden how much Poland has changed since I've been living here, and not only for the better. The commitment to Christianity is in free fall. The demographic situation is increasingly catastrophic. The glorification of everything that is Western is highly questionable, and knowledge of one's own identity is steadily diminishing. Hedonism, materialism, atheism, globalism, Americanization, gender ideology, cheap moral activism, all of this has increased rapidly in the few years that I have been here. And it is not to be assumed that this trend will be reversed in the near future. At the same time, the gradual perversion of the European Union has led many people on the political right to abandon the idea of a common European civilization state and to focus entirely on sovereignism and the nation state, which in my view is nearly an error as big as the abstract multiculturalism and globalism preached by the Brussels technocracy. Hence, Poland is about to fall into the same trap that my own country was caught in 2 or 3 decades ago. And all warnings are falling on deaf ears, it seems to me. Apparently, all European countries have to go through the same development, come what may, so that the hope I long cherished that at least Poland and Hungary would learn from the West's mistakes and develop an alternative early on was probably in vain. Nevertheless, it seems to me, while this development may have been inevitable, it could have been steered in a more constructive and intelligent direction with the help of an appropriate identity policy. It was perhaps inevitable that the majority of the population would make the same mistakes as their neighbors in the West. However, it would have been perfectly possible to prepare at least a certain minority of the Polish people for the hard times about to come and build up a true internal resistance, especially among young patriots, as I've tried to show in my book, What is to be Done. A measure that, however, it seems to me, has been largely neglected in recent years, unfortunately. Would this have changed the 2023 elections? Perhaps not, but the current situation would have been much more promising. Another regret concerns Poland's external impact. For it is not only the case that Poland knows itself less and less, Poland is also not really known abroad, which in my opinion is a real catastrophe. While all the other great European countries have a relatively clear profile in the collective consciousness, Poland remains the great unknown. If you ask a Frenchman, a Spaniard, or even a German what they associate culturally with Poland, you probably won't get many answers other than concentration camps, Warsaw, and John Paul II. Poland is a tabula rasa in the collective consciousness of Europeans. And unfortunately, even after 8 years of conservative government, almost nothing has changed. Even translations of classic Polish writers are virtually impossible to find. But this also means that the corresponding lies about Poland fall on fertile ground because there is no counter-narrative to counter them. In addition to the blatant failure in cultural policy, there is also a widespread inactivity in terms of information policy. While Germany, Russia, the United States, and even France maintain countless foundations, associations, and media outlets abroad in order to bring their respective views into the opinion-forming process of their neighbors, Poland has done nothing of the sort, apart from a few weak and late attempts, and has also largely refraining from establishing closer contacts with potential political and media partners. Because, whether you like it or not, Poland's future will not be decided in Warsaw, but in Brussels. And if you want to counter the left-wing liberal kraken with an appropriate resistance, this can only be done through close cooperation between European conservatives, as I've tried to show in my books Renovatio Europae, Europa Eterna, and latest Défendre l'Europe civilisationnelle. The consequence of this, probably involuntary, because not at all conceptualized, splendid isolation, has been a far-reaching isolation of Polish conservatives in the European discourse. And if you don't know someone, you don't feel responsible for him. Once again, this may not have had a decisive influence on the outcome of the elections, but it would have significantly improved the current situation. Is it too late now? No, because it would be a serious mistake to link political action only with nation-state competences. Identity politics, cultural politics, and alliance politics can also be pursued from the opposition bank, albeit with considerably fewer means of power. It is time to finally break out of the outdated categories of the nation-state of the 1990s and 2000s and to open up to the much more complex but also much more promising political situation of the present, where the struggle is not fought anymore through laws, but through NGOs, through the media, through newspapers, through movies, through foundations, through novels, through tweets, through academies, through music pieces, or through summer universities. But that's enough for me. The battle for the future of not only Poland, but the whole of Europe is in full swing. And the final word has not yet been said. Whether it will be possible for me to continue this fight in Poland, I do not know. Because during the last year, I have unfortunately lost all my professional employments in Poland for directly or indirectly political reasons. And so I will have to turn to Western Europe again, for better or for worse, in order to continue to feed my family. These are, unfortunately, the occupational hazards that come with being a dissident, as you all know all too well from your own political history. But whatever happens, I do not want to and will not betray Poland whenever it is necessary to counter disinformation about your country. You can count on me. Thank you very much for your attention, and may God bless Poland and our European civilization. Plus ultra.
Profesor David Engels.
Professor David Engels.
Dziękuję Państwu za owację na
Thank you very much for this
za
standing ovation.
ten piękny gest.
Thank you for this beautiful
Thank you for your
gesture.
speech. Dziękujemy za te ciepłe słowa skierowane pod
Thank
naszym
you for
adresem
the
przez pana
warm
profesora.
words
Dziękuję kapitule.
to us. I thank
Dziękuję
the
Państwu.
chapter and I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Chcą jeszcze coś postawić kropkę nad i nie chcą.
Professors
Dziękuję.
don't want to take
Szanowni
the
Państwo,
floor.
jutro
Thank
też
you
jest
very
dzień
much.
trzeci,
Tomorrow is another day,
jutro dużo miejsca poświęcamy
day 3, and we will
kulturze, bo ona też jest niezwykle ważna.
speak a lot about
Polska,
culture, which is a very important
kultura jest bez
piece,
wątpienia
the parcel,
fundamentem, który
part
będzie
of
ogromne
the
znaczenie
Polish,
dla
the great project going forward. And we will discuss journalism, the media, and the future of the media in Poland. So
Do zobaczenia.
see you
Proszę
tomorrow.
nie zapomnieć
And by the way,
zestawu.
please return the headsets, the translation
Będą
headsets.
potem skargi i prośby, żeby zwracać to jutro, więc lepiej zrobić to dziś. Spokojnego wieczoru i do zobaczenia. Dziękuję.
See you tomorrow.